All right, welcome back. We're about to start our next section here. John Israel, if you have not met him before, is a CISO, global CISO at KPMG. He's helped a lot of our portfolio companies get some product feedback. So I'll bring John up here and he'll introduce his panel. So welcome our next panel, John, and take it away. Thanks.
Appreciate it.
You bet.
All right. It's good to see everybody here today. Guys, why don't you come on out? Go ahead and have a seat. My name is John Israel, and I'm the global CISO for KPMG. And companies we have with us today are Tam Noon, Wiz, and Sierra. We'll get into introductions here in a moment. It's good to be back. I spoke last year about data and AI security, something that I'm really passionate about. I was telling these guys, in the lobby earlier that going to have a lot of fun today. I had a lot of fun last year. No one on the panel last year talks to me anymore, but I promise we're going to have a lot of fun this year. So, any matter. So we are going to talk about a mix of data, AI security, and data monetization. And a little bit like Reese's Cups and the peanut butter and chocolate, it's a little bit hard to separate the difference between where AI security starts and data security starts. But before we get into that, why don't we do introductions? And we all promised each other we had plan A on the paper, and plan B is going to be the best. So we hope to get some good conversation going today. So go ahead.
Absolutely. So hey, everyone. My name is Nick Tamakandu. I'm here with Wiz. Wiz is a company that started with cloud security, but at this point our mission is to secure everything. And the way that we do that is we help customers identify risk in their environment, risk and threats, help them prioritize those risks and threats, and then help them remediate those risks and threats across code, cloud, on-premise, and real-time threat detection and response. And so happy to be here.
Idan?
Thank you, everyone. Hi, Idan. Thanks for having me. Co-founder, CTO, I'm here with Tam Noon. In Tam Noon, we are very focused on remediation. We love to say that we start where the CNAP is end. And we help companies taking all the massive signals, issues, alerts into remediation in an efficient way, expedite the remediation process. We do a lot of investigation and operational investigation, and we have what we call safe remediation because we want them to fix security and not break anything in production.
Thanks, Idan. Sean?
Hi, thank you for having me here today, and hello, everybody. My name is Sean Cordero. I'm the Chief AI Security Officer at Sierra. Sierra has a handful of key missions that we're focused on, but the most important one right now is preparing enterprises for the agentic AI era. And we started doing this by building the most comprehensive data security platform that currently exists. And we have continued to develop these capabilities to really enable enterprises to not only understand where the most critical data assets are, but then how are those actually consumed in the agentic world today, inclusive of the additional guardrails that don't come out of the box when you decide to go down the path of agentic deployments.
So we're going to start with AI security, and I think a question I always ask lately, just for fun in meetings, is how many times have you heard the word Anthropic or Mythos today? And so to frame this up, in about 2 minutes, real quick. The Mythos story, in my humble opinion, we'll kind of break out into get your perspectives as well. Mythos is part of a longer trend that began back in 2023, right? With the first AI-enabled attack, but more broadly, my experience has been a compression of the attack chain. And what I mean by that is the time it takes between a company that is signaling a patch is coming out to when a threat actor is able to reverse engineer that patch, to developing an exploit, scanning, prioritizing, calling in the results, attacking, and moving inside. I think it's all a stat, and they're fairly consistent. Whether you're looking at like Verizon data breach incident report or the zero-day clock or others, about 2019 that took the time frame measured in months, well over a year in some cases, right? That's hard work. Starting in 2023, some of the numbers that changed profoundly was this attack chain compression. There are others as well, and I'll mention in a second, but we're well below 15 minutes right now.
Yeah.
And if you think about the impact that's had on enterprise organizations, that's been profound across the whole spectrum of what your companies provide. We pivoted towards speed, velocity, cyber hygiene, posture management across all disciplines, mastering the 3 planes of AI security of, with, and from, data security and monetization, or data security management. Those are the key pillars of our strategy. Another stat that I felt was compelling in the security from AI, these AI-enabled tools, when ChatGPT broke out in late 2022 and really hit the press in 23, the correlation to the uptick in the number of sophisticated threat actors that are being tracked by the major houses, right? The people with the names that everyone recognizes, 500% increase in those names because of the enablement that has happened from generative AI along the way. So let's talk a little bit about your perspectives of the broader cyber environment with lens on AI security. So Nick, how about you first?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things going on here, and you're absolutely right that the speed of attack has increased significantly, right? We're seeing not only just new threat vectors and new novel type of attacks going on, but also increased speed of exploitation, the techniques that attackers or threat actors are using to evade detection is also changing, but also the nature of applications itself. I don't want to be the alarmist and say like it's all doom and gloom here, because I actually think AI represents an opportunity for defenders as well, right? The number one thing that AI allows us to do is actually capitalize on a lot of the data that we have in our environments and use that for defense in addition to offense, right? So while the threat actor may be looking at this and saying, hey, I can now reverse engineer a technology or come up with some new way to exploit what's out there, so can the defense come in and say, hey, we now have the ability to look across our landscape, identify what's actually at risk, and then proactively take countermeasures appropriately, right? Where I think organizations have to focus is, how do we get all of that data into the right place? How do we enable the decision makers to make those decisions on what to prioritize? And then how do we give teams the visibility and insight into what they actually have to remediate? Can we automate some of those processes with our partners? And can we actually get to the reduction of risk while we're exposing ourselves to new risk here, right?
That's great. It's a pretty good setup for you, Don. But before we get to that, you mentioned the use of AI as a defender. That's been really core to our strategy. We've big users of Bricklayer from agentic AI SOC strategy. Love the red agent as well. That is killer. The speed and the increase in efficacy of our security program is profound, with all these tools in play right now. But with that said, the bedrock in my mind has, I always tell our board and others that the basics matter.
Yeah.
They continue to matter, right? Don, it's probably a great place for you to jump in on this.
Sure. So I'll just echo what Nick said about, and you as well, about how those AI tools make the life of those malicious actors super easy. And I'll add for that, the amount of code and new kind of infrastructure that companies add to their environment just because it's more easy. And today you have also agents that develop new code, new features, new products, sometimes some of them outside of engineering and different department, and before that was never kind of in the market of building infrastructure and solutions. It's just you have, from one hand, a lot of more potential risk coming in. From the other hand, it's much more, they do that. They exploit it much more faster. 20 years vulnerability that was discovered after 5 minutes scanning, it's insane. And I think the sentiment we have to change. It's no longer, how can I live with a backlog? How can I ignore my medium, my low, my informational sometimes that can become really critical in day of usage. And we have to react and respond faster. And that's how, leveraging and using those tools, Frontier AI, not just for attackers to use that, Frontier AI for us as the defender, remediate and to expedite the remediation and using all those amazing tools outside that give us those signals quick, and how can we react faster and close the loop with remediation.
One of the interesting changes I've seen in our program, as well as other CISOs I talked to, has been this change of, rather than looking at each posture management discipline myopically, they're beginning to combine perspectives and looking across all those dimensions, all at once. Sean, how about you? Do you want to round out the AI security topic?
Yeah, I do think that the compression is incredibly real, but it's nothing really new. If we think about it from the perspective of prepackaged exploits that have existed in the open source community for a long time, the research community, I remember the days when there was still dialogue going back and forth about, well, there's a 0 day. Should the vendor tell everybody the same time that everyone else finds out? Should we tell the customers first? I remember those conversations specifically around the initial Patch Tuesday back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. What I think is fundamentally shifted, though, is aside from the compression, what I'm also seeing is an expansion in terms of the gap, which is effectively this. There have been, for decades now, areas within a cyber program, not to paint with a broad brush, but in many cyber programs, that the effort was primarily focused on, let's say, one element of enablement, right? So that's going to look like your compliance programs. That's going to look like these other things that you have to do to remain on the right side of the law. But that came at a great expense, which is the fundamentals fell to the side. So if 0 days increase, which they're going to, what then has to change on the other end of that? Which is, do we then get to never-ending continuous updates? Most likely, because there's just no way to actually address that. And that's where the gap comes in. The entirety of the processes that have existed within industry for the last 30 years, they're effectively unchanged. So change management, change control, change windows, all of these things, I think need to really be looked at as a whole industry, because those models may not be relevant anymore.
Yeah, that's actually been, I flinched a little bit because that's been my last couple weeks of having that conversation, with the CIO and other IT leaders. Of one hand, we need to look at the threat and the compression of time and the remediation cycle, but then the practicality of executing the reactionary type of changes in a time frame that matters. And it's coupled with both an approach to automation. Actually, it's automation. I think it's actually contextualizing the information and making more informed decisions about what needs to be fixed immediately. There's just this broad, hard discussion that's going on right now. It's not just an IT ops, it's at a governance level as well about risk appetite. And I think today companies will probably choose to take a knee and isolate for a period of time until they can adequately test and handle the patching cycle. But automation is going to be part of that. So shifting into one of my favorite topics, everything data, data security, data management. Also, another thing that's coincident to AI coming about was the velocity of risk associated with the data layer. Not just structured, but especially in the unstructured environment. That east-west movement throughout an organization became as important as the north-south that people were typically worried about with data loss protection and email and all these other things. Something that I have seen is, big picture, is that the tooling that we've used for endpoint protection and isolation has gotten really good, especially if you're on top of content development, that cyber incidents are trending down, but the information-related incidents are trending up rapidly. And within that, you've got two buckets. In my mind, I see a low velocity information event. People that are using ChatGPT inappropriately upload a file, singular events that are low. But especially with the adoption of agentic AI and pre-MCP, we're seeing that explosion of an API state down below it, and thus the high velocity type of data exposure events. What's your take on this? Sean, let's start with you.
So if we use MCP as an example, right? One of the things that is not problematic, but it's simply the nature of what it is there are elements within building, let's say, a set of MCP servers for the purposes of enabling tooling for an agent. But there's security considerations that go into the building of said MCP. Irregardless of the tooling, it might be actually calling, which also has security implications. So I'm seeing a different type of supply chain risk as organizations are rolling their own MCP, which you can have your agent create an MCP server for anything. It knows how to do it. But then what are the hooks that are going into it? Is that something that you really need to do it via that? We were having a conversation earlier about at what point do you actually need to have an agent doing the work when it should be a more deterministic process like a script, right? So I fundamentally think that there are going to be different modalities of the calling of tooling. So obviously you have the MCP approach, you have and you had mentioned this earlier too, John, which is the explosion of now direct API calls because you're getting into token economics around, well, that's a heavy load every time I'm loading that into the context window versus do I just create skills for this, which then start looking like much more deterministic.
Yeah.
So I think the confluence of all of these things are going to create a little bit, for some organizations, analysis paralysis, which is I want to empower my agents to be able to do the thing that they need to do, whether that's very narrowly defined or broadly defined, hopefully a little more narrow. But whichever approach I take, the underlying security considerations really are not unchanged. The difference now is that the interdependencies that you would have had perhaps in a B2B context is now literally within your own environment.
Yeah. At the end of this, we're going to talk about investable gaps, and I'm going to violate that and hop in right now with one. Something you mentioned made me think about, you mentioned skills, right? And I was talking to my deputy earlier about the progression of topics that dominated discussion between Gen AI and the models, then it became agents, right? Big discussion about skills, gets into your agent architecture, right? Focus on more agents or develop your skills platform. People are talking about harnesses now, but on the skills part, I think that's a key capability gap that we see is people are going to develop skills, and within those skills, there's going to be intellectual property, the things and how people do things, and that's a different type of YAML file, right? So how do you protect that, right? How do you identify that across your data estate? How do you protect it? How do I tell the difference between this is IP, this is non-IP? So really glad you brought that up.
That's actually a really great point, though, because even something as straightforward as the development of a skill, you're effectively encapsulating entire elements of a business process in that.
Yes.
That in and of itself, outside of what the skill actually says, what scripts are in there, what it calls, that's value.
That's the battleground. One of the battlegrounds currently is how do I take the processes and procedures that are now currently scripts everywhere or in people's heads, and at scale and volume be able to drive those into skills that you can leverage across your agent infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Real important. So glad we had that conversation. Idan, how about you?
Yeah, I think I'll take the point of view of the posture and the sanitization. So I think eventually, at the end of the day, data is our crown jewel, and we have to treat it as our crown jewel. As we treat our crown jewel and our valuable in our home kind of a private life, We never keep the house open. We never keep the vault open. We never keep the window open. We kind of mitigate and proactive for that. And I think from that perspective, the kind of a dimension of risk that AI and agentic and vibe coding and MCP and everything added to the equation is just extremely huge. And we need to go to the foundation where we said, okay, we have to keep our environment sanitized. We have to keep our hygiene proper. We have to fix those kind of a perimeter all over. The data, the network, the compute, the access in a proper way that we will gain a control, we will gain the visibility that we need. And that's, from my perspective, that's the main key of how we can start keeping that data and the production of that new data and old data and everything together secured and safe.
Thanks, Idan. Nick?
Yeah, I think going back to the basics here, right, as Idan was mentioning, I think identity is such a core function that is a basic thing. We've been talking about identity forever, right? But what are your agents able to do? What can they see is an identity question, right? We have the data catalog. We may have the data organized in certain ways, but we want to make sure that what a user is able to do, what an employee is able to do, what a customer is able to do, matches what we want them to do, whether they operate through an agent today or a human agent today or an AI agent in the future, right? So I think that's a critical part of managing the data risk here, right? Then that goes into, all right, well, what is the threat vector and the attack vector on this given the different modalities of data that we have? So are we looking at unstructured data that's going through a pipeline? Well, do we know how much of that is used for training? What is the risk from a threat modeling perspective of data poisoning and bad quality data, et cetera, right? Like, how can we imagine that? What is the impact of that on business processes, right? Especially as we extrapolate these business processes away from deterministic systems into non-deterministic agents operating each other and working in coordination. I think the visibility of how these systems operate is really, really key and is going to be more and more important, right? There's the old adage that you can't manage what you don't measure, right? And being able to measure what identities exist, what agents exist, what tools exist, what skills exist, what users are accessing this, what data points they connect to, where the perimeter and the edge is on all of this, and then applying those same basic principles, least privilege, making sure that we control access, making sure that we have regular spot checks, that we're auditing our systems. I think all of those fundamentals still apply to these AI systems to help us manage what is a low velocity data risk and a high velocity data risk there.
You put that really well, and I'm glad you brought up identity, framed it the way you did. I think that's an incredibly hard problem. Non-human identities presently an issue, and it's also one of those areas that could stand investment and change over the next year, given the complexity. And only in this moment, perspective matters, but in this moment, it reminded me of, you go back 20, 26 years in the organization I was with, the government, that at a point in time, if you look at how IT changed, we go from circuits, and there were a lot of people that understood, the basic construct of your IT stack. And from circuits, then you go into IP, fewer people. You go into MPLS, ATM first, and then fewer people, then MPLS, and then this thing called the cloud came out, and it just blew everybody away because of the complexity that was abstracted from everybody. And very few people actually understood what was going on behind the scenes. And I think what you're saying actually made me think about that, is that all these things that you have to do, the basics of, become extraordinarily hard, especially right now because all this is new and people are not just learning the tech, they're learning the lexicon, right?
Yeah.
They're learning everything about AI.
Yeah.
And I challenge everybody to say, do you know what a harness is? And I bet you only 2 people out of 10 get that answer, right? It's hard. And I think that people that can create capabilities to make the stack less complex, right? Abstract that complexity in a positive way are really going to be big winners.
And I'll add that, at the same time that we're undergoing this transformation in our industry, the opportunity is massive as well, right? And we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in a little bit. But the capacity for us to take all of this data and kind of say, how do we monetize it in one aspect, but also how do we open this up for new business, capabilities that we've never thought about before, right? I think all of us as security practitioners should take away from that, like, we've got to be an enablement function because the business wants to take more risks, right? I think all of our customers are taking more risks every day. If we get in the way and all we do is say no, 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 right, then we're not going to be working here much longer, right? So how do we actually enable the business to take the risks while all this technology change is happening? I think having that empathy of 2 years ago, if you asked what MCP was, I'm sure somebody would have talked to you about coffee, right? And today we're talking MCP and tools. None of these things existed, so we've got to be humble about that.
Totally. I think one last thing about that's kind of a topic, because I feel like that's the moment where all these issues that we discovered when cloud came and before that mostly impact the industry, the enterprise, the vendors, the companies, today shift also to the consumers.
Yeah.
Like you see people adopting, non-technical people, like giving AI agents access to their own crown jewels, to their own data.
Right.
They don't have any clue about privacy and access and security. And that's a question, kind of a big question mark for ourselves as an industry, like when are we going to tackle that? Like when are we going to help the consumer, the end, kind of at the edge, to be more secure with the adoption of those capabilities and tools?
The conversation we had backstage, I think Sean and I were talking about this a bit, is one of the harder forcing functions that's kind of exacerbating these problems you're talking about is something as simple as, like in high school, someone sees a kid with another pair of tennis shoes and they want them, no matter if their arch is the same shape or whatever else, they got to have it. And so the business is launching into, I need this, because to remain relevant for talent or relevant in the market, we have to be able to say that we have agents. And I think that's putting a lot of risk compression on organizations, and while everyone's still sorting out, like, how do you do these really, really hard things while we're all learning, while the capabilities in industry are all maturing, right? While you're trying to wrap around a business model around this, it's really hard, like really difficult. So now we've told you about how the world's going to end, about data. Let's shift to something a little bit more fun. By the way, Nick, I love the setup there. That was perfect. Like, Andy, $5, I would. This concept of data monetization, and if you look at the arc of the possible, between this end state, and we'll get to that. In my mind, we talked a little bit about this earlier. There's some really simple opportunities and problems that get solved, and I think it starts with something that, and I don't, claim this as my own, someone smarter than me has probably already come up with this, but I look at myself as a chief secure transformational officer, right? And you talked about how we as practitioners should be enablers, right? One of the opportunities is, as you're doing data well, right, data security and data management well, and you're mitigating risk, that's the cousin to the opportunities that open up, right? And so, KPMG, we moved some of the data management functions under the CISO because we sold this vision of this arc of possibility. One of the simple problems that has popped up in the news lately is about provenance. And I forget the stats, but everything at one point in time was all human generated, right? And then at a point in time, it became more and more and more synthetic content, and that ballooned up when 2023 happened, right? And so there's this very interesting intersection between human and synthetic content, and a need to evidence that human-in-the-loop trusted AI, that human review in here and that provenance. So Let's spend a moment on that because I think that's the more near-term, tangible opportunity that's there, for business, especially in the regulated business, to represent um, their IP and their product and make sure that on one hand they can embrace their use of AI as a tool, but not come across as having the AI slop that's become part of the news lately. So, John, start with you on this.
So your concept of the monetization of how could this be leveraged in the sense of if I have great hygiene, great security practices, there is inherent value in either some of these data elements or the elements themselves combined into some sort of meta-analysis, right? Which then provides new context that then could be valuable to a third party. This actually reminds me of a problem that you had mentioned that in your organization, you have aspects of records that are that fall under your purview. I had a similar thing like that. I used to own records management as chief security officer, and one of those key functions, this is over a decade ago now, was the true and exact copy of student loans. And what a lot of folks didn't know is that if you ever were to challenge a loan back then, you could request that the court and the underwriter furnish the actual exact and original copy. That copy itself, if they could not provide it, they would dismiss your loan. Even though they then made changes where it's like, well, it can be a true and exact copy, but the gold standard was a human punching the actual wet signed contract. And that piece of paper was more valuable than any of the things that were within the system. Right? We had all this metadata specific to that particular student or that particular loan, but without that human review that is effectively validating that, yes, this is a real document, the value would effectively fall off. So I find that a fascinating approach where you could have a human in the middle that is doing that validation and saying, yes, this data, part of it is synthetically created by an AI, but a human with expertise is effectively signing off on it, the effective stamp on it.
Yeah, I see a world, we're going to come back to provenance and quality, but I see a world where this matters about the human edited, not only did they edit it, but 32% of that document was edited. That's a version. And then you've got some backend like Trust ID or something using blockchain in the backside to keep track of the lineage, so provenance and lineage of that file. So we're going to come back to that point. I'm glad you brought that up. Let's talk a little bit about insight for a moment. This, as practitioners, if we do this well, we tell a story that invokes the possibility. And what I've used, and others are probably saying the same thing, is imagine a world where if I have control of my data, if I can say, what data do I have, where is that data located, who has access to it, and how is it moving throughout my estate, if I can do that, then also can I interrogate that, and can I ask questions of my data layer, right? And imagine where you're able to ask a question of, I want this client, this contract that's not responsive to this regulation or this law, and at that point I can be responsible in segregating a subset of the files, a lasso effect, if you will, in creating a custom rag source, for an endeavor, internal or external. Let's talk a little bit about insight and maybe some of the challenges of realizing maybe that vision. Nick, start with you.
Yeah, I think going back to the first point you made, provenance is probably the biggest challenge in that, right? As organizations, we collect so much data at this point, right? Whether it's from employees or customers or business processes, and then we mingle that through a whole bunch of different set of applications and tools, right? And that's great, it's helping us support the business as we execute today. If you imagine that each layer in that process or those business processes are now going to get transformed through some sort of agentic revolution, right? Whether that's human in the loop, or I've heard the term now human on the loop, where agents are now working and you're kind of reviewing and spot checking. The provenance of where did that data originate, how did it get transformed, what did the transformation and what was the effect of that transformation, I think is really, really key. Because at the end of the day, I think organizations will move towards this system of data fabric, call it, right? Of like, hey, this is all of the data that exists in my enterprise. And having a well-sourced, well-governed data fabric there is going to be critical in order to get your agents to actually start taking actions in a high confidence interval, right? So I think making sure we understand what are the transformations that are happening, where the data starts with, and who touches it is a critical part in actually achieving that vision. And I think everyone is going to get there. At what speed and how we can help you do that is probably the challenge that we have right now.
Don, if we look at this as data is kind of the new oil, right, from a value standpoint, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a moment, that has to be extracted using a machine, right? And I think you guys have a good optic of the machine, from a posture standpoint. So I'm interested in kind of your optic of what the challenges are around enabling a business to track provenance and to do the insight capabilities we just spoke about.
Sure, I think it's like both perspectives are super valid, and one of the things that we're very proud with is the human in the loop. It's just not controlling, like let the agent or the model do whatever they want. We all know eventually by the end of the day, it's all statistical and trying to predict what's the next token, at least right now. And hallucinations and kind of a missing interpretation of situation are very common. So you have to keep still the human in the loop to verify and validate. I think the source of the data, if I'm taking that outside of my prisma of how we use that in general, if you want to use data as oil, right, and monetize it. And I'm speaking from a practitioner point of view, right? I remember the days that we used to go to get some iris data set from academics to train our models. You have to understand that the model have to contain and collect those valid kind of insight and information. As my first lecture, like my first professor in the first class in machine learning, back those days, I won't say when, but he said garbage in, garbage out. Yeah. Like eventually, if you bring bad data and not a authentic one, it's a problem. Another point of view is more ethical. Like how can we control the consuming of that? If I wanna make sure that someone doing a proper and ethical things with my data, training the right models and not just use them for non-ethical kind of use cases.
Yeah, that's doing a little bit of reading about homomorphic encryption and different ways to protect your data. That's a whole other space, So if we look at this, we talked earlier about data is oil, right? It comes back to there's this value equation that's there, right? Yeah. And I think that if companies, once they at scale begin to realize that the majority of the world's data is within the firewall, right? It's in the frontier state, not publicly reachable. As models need to improve, as they are more hungry for more data, as companies want to perfect their craft, if you will, I think it's going to have everybody look at their data state as an asset, and that's going to require management. But I think one of the key things is it changes that value equation. Many general counsels look at microtransactions like conversations and everything as potential liabilities. And while that may still be true, I think the value of having that data managed properly is value that's been going down the drain for a while. Becomes like that the movie Dune, where they never let a drop of water hit the floor, right? Yeah. You want to collect it all, manage it all to be able to extract this. And to kind of close out this, the world of the strange, if we have this data layer, if we have control over it, if we can responsibly interrogate it, there's a lot of possibility for, for instance, people to, like a PE firm to come in and fund the capabilities to put the machine in place to be able to harvest, the concept of a data yield rights, right? Kind of like in oil and gas industry, they separate the minerals from the land rights. You can separate the data yield rights from a data estate, never transfer control, right? But they fund, capabilities to come in and get the data yield rights off. And there's a lot of people that think that's not too far away over the horizon. So it took a few took a few laps around the trees to build from AI to AI security to data to the monetization, but in a way it kind of all fits together. Let's close out with a little bit of fun here. So we have an audience of founders and operators and capital builders, right? So one of the things they're most interested in is where are the investable gaps, right? Where has money not saturated yet, and what's going to be the new opportunities coming up over the horizon? So start around here. Nick, how about you go first? What do you think?
Yeah, I think in the last few years and months, there's been tremendous amount of effort putting into coding agents and how coding agents are going to upskill organizations and generate lots of new code, right? But I think there's so much code in traditional business processes and traditional applications. There's a lot of stuff still running on Fortran and Pascal and systems today, right? And I know there are some organizations that are trying to solve that challenge of how do we upskill this, but I think that's still untapped. And I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in how we do that in not just a way that changes the code to something more modern, but also builds the systems around it so that the processes and the people and the customers all get a better experience than they had before, right? I think that's untapped still.
Awesome. You done?
Yeah, I think identity, entitlement, like we didn't solve the human and non-human identity yet, and now winter is coming with the army of agent, and we all need to be prepared for that. And I'll add for that also the consumer side. Like I feel like we have to start investing on that and thinking how can we help the non-technical person in the house that just spin out Claw and let it access to everything.
You said the magic word. You didn't say Mythos or Anthropic, but you said Claude. It's the 100th time today. All good. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
And that's it. I think like the enterprise and the consumer and the end user and the identity and the entitlement access.
Excellent. Sean?
I think to your point, the on-ramping of an organization to be prepared for and or running alongside, whether it's agentic workflows or even just the adoption of AI period, is an area to me that feels that there's still some untapped opportunities there. I'm not necessarily talking about training. That's portions of the equation, but I don't think that that's the big thing. To me, it's one of these situations where if I'm an end user and my organization says, hey, you now have access to Claude and Claude Code. And we were talking about this earlier. The moment that I download that onto my computer, I now have an agentic-based capability that I didn't have before, that I could potentially accidentally hurt myself or the organization with. Mm-hmm. Because now all of the sins of the past are brought to the forefront.
Yep.
And the agent doesn't care that you haven't ever accessed that particular destination on the file server, or doesn't care that you shouldn't have the ability to log into that server. All it knows is that you asked it to do something, and it's going to use everything that it has available to itself to be able to execute on that mission. So it echoes what was already said, but ultimately, how does an organization navigate that when there's really not a lot of instruction manuals for your traditional knowledge worker?
Makes sense. To kind of close up, in life, we're all fortunate to be surrounded by really smart people, right? We're all the product of our experiences, good and bad. And I think that, myself and the audience, this is a real treat. I have Wiz and Tamnoon and Saira here on the stage. Like, you guys are really, like, shaking things up out there. And behind the scenes outside of this forum, You guys are thought leaders, and you challenge me every day, so I appreciate that. And thanks for taking time away from a very busy founder life and unicorns, and you guys are great. I appreciate you coming down from New York and places to join us today. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Guys, great job. Thank you. Terrific.